The mahogany desk in the office of First National was polished to such a high sheen that Arthur could see his own reflection in it, cracked, distorted, and weary. It was a reflection he didn't care for much these days. Across from him sat Mr. Henderson, a man whose tailored suit seemed to repel the very idea of manual labor. Henderson was currently looking at the loan application in his hand as if it were a stained napkin left over from a roadside diner. "Mr. Miller," Henderson began, his voice dripping with that polished, condescending veneer that only career bureaucrats truly master. "I'm going to be blunt. This application is, fundamentally incomplete. And the documentation you've provided? It's erratic." Arthur felt the familiar heat rising in his neck, a sensation he usually pushed down with the discipline of 30 years spent wrenching rusted bolts off undercarriages. "The documentation is accurate, Mr. Henderson. Every receipt, every tax stamp, every deed transfer. It's all there." Henderson sighed, a slow, performative sound of exhausted patience. He pushed the folder back across the desk with his index finger. "Legal descriptions are not merely suggestions, Arthur. They are the language of property. What you have here is a mess of handwritten notes and local filings that, frankly, look more like the scribblings of someone who struggles with basic literacy than a serious land development plan. We deal in standardized instruments. If you can't navigate the simplest procedural requirements of a land registry, how can you expect the bank to trust you with a commercial-grade construction loan?" The word illiterate hung in the air, unsaid but perfectly audible. It was the subtext of every interaction Arthur had had with the bank for the last 6 months. They saw the grease under his fingernails and the faded overalls, and they translated those into a lack of sophistication. They saw a mechanic and assumed he didn't understand the machinery of the law. "I understand the requirements," Arthur said, his voice steady, though his pulse hammered against his ribs. "Do you?" Henderson countered, leaning back. "Because the county archive is a labyrinth, even for trained attorneys. We require a clear title, chain of custody for the last 40 years, and an environmental impact survey that isn't sourced from local county lore. You're chasing shadows, Arthur. This land was abandoned for a reason. There's a cloud on this title that you clearly don't have the pedigree to clear. My advice? Go back to the shop. Leave the land deals to those who know how to read the fine print." Arthur stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply picked up his folder, the paper edges sharp against his calloused palms. He knew exactly what Henderson was doing, the classic stalling tactic used to keep smaller players out of the commercial acquisition market. By questioning his administrative capability, they were effectively killing his momentum without ever having to officially deny the loan. He walked out of the bank and into the harsh, midday glare of the street. His truck was parked at the curb, a battered Ford that had more miles on its chassis than most people put on their cars in a lifetime. As he climbed into the cab, he looked down at the folder. Inside were not just receipts, but a series of cryptic, hand-drawn maps he had been cross-referencing for weeks. He wasn't an illiterate mechanic, as they liked to imply. He was a man who understood how systems were built. He knew that if you wanted to know why a car engine was knocking, you didn't look at the dash lights, you stripped the block down to the casing. He was about to do the exact same thing to the county's land registry. He started the engine, the familiar rattle a grounding comfort. He wasn't going home. He was heading to the basement of the old county courthouse, a place where the air smelled of dust, damp limestone, and the rotting paper of a century's worth of broken promises. Henderson thought he was chasing shadows. What Henderson didn't realize was that Arthur had already found the ghost in the machine. The basement of the county courthouse was a subterranean vault where time didn't just slow down, it stagnated. Rows of heavy steel shelving groaned under the weight of buckram-bound ledgers, their spines cracked and fading. Arthur stepped into the cool, stagnant air, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hum of the building's aging HVAC system. He wasn't a stranger here. Over the last month, he had become a fixture, sitting at the scarred oak table in the corner, his presence as consistent as the rising damp in the walls. Most people who visited the archives were looking for something simple, a quick deed search, a marriage certificate, or an easement confirmation. They expected a clerk to press a few keys, print a document, and send them on their way. Arthur, however, was playing a different game. He wasn't looking for a record, he was looking for a narrative. He opened his notebook, a thick, spiral-bound affair filled with schematics that looked less like legal notes and more like a circuit diagram. He had learned early on that in property law, as in internal combustion, the most critical failures weren't found in the primary components, but in the connections, the small, overlooked gaskets and washers that held the pressure. He pulled a massive ledger from the shelf labeled 1954 to 1956, Municipal Annexations. His fingers, thick and steady, turned the pages with practiced care. He was looking for the silent transfer, a specific period where the county had rezoned a massive swathe of industrial fringe, a move that theoretically simplified development. But in the fine print of the supplemental annexures, he had noticed a discrepancy. Years ago, a regional utility holding company had acquired a temporary easement for infrastructure that was never built. That easement was still on the books, effectively creating a cloud that Henderson had used as an excuse to block Arthur's loan. According to the bank's internal logic, that easement made the land toxic for development. But Arthur had discovered something else, buried deep in a box of unsorted correspondence from the late 70s, a notice of intent to abandon that had been signed, notarized, but never formally recorded in the master ledger. The system was broken. The county's digital records, which Henderson and his ilk relied on, were based on a clean summary that ignored the messy, unfiled reality of the physical archives. It was a classic case of institutional inertia. Because nobody had bothered to cross-reference the physical filing cabinet with the digital migration project from the early 2000s, the notice of intent effectively didn't exist to the bank, but it existed in law. Arthur found the document. It was a fragile, yellowed slip of onion skin paper. He smoothed it out, his heart rate steady. He knew the procedural requirements for a quiet title action, a lawsuit to establish ownership, but he also knew that he didn't need a lawyer to start the process. He just needed the evidence to be undeniable. He looked at the document again. It wasn't just a notice, it was a quitclaim, signed by a representative of the defunct utility company. Whoever had processed this back in 1978 had tucked it into an unrelated folder, likely a clerical error that had sat buried for nearly 50 years. He pulled out his phone, snapped a high-resolution image of the page, the seal of the notary, and the date stamp. He stood up, his knees popping, and walked toward the clerk's desk. The clerk, a woman named Martha who had been there since the dawn of time, didn't even look up. "Same as yesterday, Arthur." "Actually, Martha," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an undercurrent of resolve, "I need to file a formal request for a certified copy of this specific instrument. And I need to know why it's not reflected in the parcel's index number 44B. Martha paused, her glasses sliding down her nose. 44B. That's commercial land. That's First National's portfolio. I know, Arthur said. But the record is incomplete. And if the record is incomplete, the title is compromised. He watched the realization flicker across her face. This wasn't just a mechanic looking for a receipt. This was a man identifying a systemic failure that could potentially invalidate hundreds of millions of dollars in outstanding loans tied to that specific industrial zone. He wasn't just reading the fine print, he was rewriting the narrative of the entire district. He didn't need to argue with Henderson. He just needed to present the bank with a document they couldn't ignore, a document that proved they had been lending on a property they didn't technically control. Arthur didn't head back to the bank immediately. He understood that timing was as critical as the evidence itself. If he marched into First National with a single piece of onion skin paper, they would brush him off as a crackpot with a misplaced receipt. He needed to apply leverage, and in the world of high-stakes finance, leverage wasn't just about money, it was about the exposure of risk. He spent the next 48 hours in his shop, but he wasn't turning wrenches. He was digitizing. He took the high-resolution images he had captured in the archives and cross-referenced them with public tax maps and the bank's own published annual reports on their industrial development assets. He found exactly what he suspected: the bank was using the 44B tract as collateral for a multi-million-dollar bond issue. The entire bond was underpinned by the assumption that the bank held a clear, undisputed title to the land. If Arthur's discovery, the unrecorded quitclaim from 1978, was brought to the attention of the state's banking regulator, the legal implications would be catastrophic. The bank would be forced to pause all transactions related to that tract, undergo an audit, and likely face a massive downgrade in their asset ratings. He drafted a letter. It wasn't written in legalese, and he didn't try to sound like an attorney. He wrote it in the language of a mechanic diagnosing a structural failure. He laid out the timeline of the 1978 abandonment, cited the specific, unrecorded instrument, and attached a copy of the certified filing he had retrieved from Martha at the courthouse. He addressed the letter not to Henderson, but to the bank's chief compliance officer, with a carbon copy sent to the State Department of Financial Regulation. He went to the post office and sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. He needed the paper trail to be as ironclad as the one he'd uncovered. As he walked back to his truck, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For years, he had operated under the assumption that the financial world was built on some kind of mystical, untouchable expertise. He had viewed bankers like Henderson as architects of a reality he was only a guest in. Now, he realized the truth: the world was built on paper, and paper was subject to the same laws of physics as anything else. It could rot, it could be misplaced, and it could be systematically ignored. If you controlled the flow of that information, if you could find the one piece of paper that didn't fit the picture, you could destabilize an entire structure. 2 days later, the phone in his shop rang. It was an office line he didn't recognize, though the area code was the bank's. "Mr. Miller. This is Mr. Henderson's assistant. Mr. Henderson would like to invite you to his office for a follow-up meeting regarding your loan application." The voice was different now, hollow, hurried, and devoid of the performative arrogance from their last encounter. "I'm busy," Arthur said, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. "I have a transmission rebuild on the lift that needs to be finished by 5. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. People in Arthur's position didn't tell bank executives they were too busy for a meeting. "Mr. Miller, this is a matter of some urgency. The bank has reviewed the documentation you sent to our compliance department." "I see," Arthur replied, his voice neutral. "Well, I suppose I could clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. Say, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock works, Mr. Miller. We look forward to seeing you." Arthur hung up. He looked around his shop, the oil-stained concrete, the disorganized pile of parts in the corner, the half-finished projects. To the outside world, this place looked like a failure. But for the first time in his life, Arthur saw it for what it truly was, his base of operations. He had built a life out of fixing things that others had deemed broken or beyond saving. He was about to apply that same skill set to an institution that had tried to write him off as illiterate. He didn't need to be a lawyer to win. He just needed to be the one who had actually bothered to read the manual. The atmosphere inside First National's executive suite had shifted from haughty condescension to a sterile, high-pressure anxiety. When Arthur stepped out of the elevator, he wasn't ushered into the waiting area to cool his heels for 20 minutes. Instead, he was greeted by a young, pale associate who practically jogged him toward the conference room. Inside, the environment was different. Henderson was present. But he sat at the far end of a long, polished table. At the head sat a woman in a sharp navy suit, the chief compliance officer, whose eyes were fixed on the document spread across the mahogany surface. Beside her sat a corporate attorney whose nervous tick, a rhythmic tapping of a fountain pen, betrayed the gravity of the situation. "Mr. Miller," the woman said, gesturing toward a chair. She didn't offer a hand, but her tone was professionally tempered. "Thank you for joining us. We have received your correspondence regarding the 44B tract." Arthur sat, placing his worn cap on the table. He didn't slouch, he didn't fidget. He looked at the documents. They had printed his findings. They had blown them up into oversized exhibits. "I assume you verified the provenance of the 1978 filing?" Arthur asked, his voice calm. The attorney cleared his throat. "We have. It appears to be an authentic, albeit misfiled, instrument of conveyance. It was never extinguished through the proper administrative channels. Which means, Arthur continued, that the utility company's claim on that land remained active until they dissolved, at which point the interest should have reverted to the original easement holders, which, according to the original 1920s deeds I also pulled from the archive, includes the parcel currently designated for my development project. He wasn't guessing anymore. He had spent the last 24 hours in the basement of the records office, linking the 1978 paperwork to the original survey maps. He had created a chain of title that the bank's own software had failed to register. You've effectively created a deadlock on the entire industrial park's collateral status, the woman said, her eyes narrowing. Do you have any idea what the implications of this are? I know it's a structural failure, Arthur said, leaning forward. The bank has been leveraging a property with a clouded title. If the regulators look closely at the bond issue backed by this tract, they're going to find that the collateral is essentially locked in a perpetual legal dispute. That's not a risk, Mrs. Sterling. That's a liability. The room went dead silent. Henderson shifted in his seat, his face pale. Arthur knew he had them. He wasn't just talking about his own loan, he was talking about the bank's solvency regarding their entire portfolio in the district. What do you want, Arthur? Henderson asked, his voice cracking slightly. I don't want a handout, Arthur said. And I certainly don't want to hear about my literacy levels again. I want the loan for my project approved, based on the corrected title records I've provided. I want the bank to issue a formal request for the clearing of this title, which I've already drafted for you. And I want the interest rate to reflect the risk-adjusted value of the property, now that the cloud is removed. The attorney looked at the woman in the navy suit. A silent conversation passed between them, a desperate, frantic calculation of the cost of litigation versus the cost of simply appeasing the illiterate mechanic who had somehow outmaneuvered their entire legal department. That is a significant demand, the woman said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's a bargain, Arthur corrected. I'm giving you a way to fix the error before the state regulator finds it. I'm the one doing the work of your entire department. You should be paying me a consulting fee. Arthur stood up. He didn't wait for their answer. He knew how this would go. When a system is under pressure, it chooses the path of least resistance. They would agree, they would try to keep it quiet, and they would hope he walked away with his money and stayed silent about their incompetence. He walked out of the room, leaving them alone with their spreadsheets, their nervous tics, and the cold, hard realization that the mechanic had the keys to their kingdom. He had proven that expertise wasn't found in a tie or a title, it was found in the willingness to look at the things everyone else was too busy to notice. He had walked in an outsider, but he was walking out as the architect of their next move. He had saved his project, but more importantly, he had saved his dignity. The final meeting was as brief as a formal handover of keys. Arthur didn't return to the mahogany boardroom, he met the bank's legal team in the lobby, a neutral ground that felt far more appropriate. They had the paperwork ready, the loan agreement, the corrected title filings, and the release forms. They were eager to finalize the deal, their hands moving with a hurried, practiced efficiency that spoke volumes about their desire to bury the incident. Henderson was there, but he stood to the side, a diminished figure who couldn't even meet Arthur's eyes. He had spent his career looking down at people like Arthur, believing that the world was divided into those who understood the machinery of high finance and those who were merely the grease for its gears. Now, the roles were inverted. The man who had been called illiterate had just dictated terms to the very institution that had held his future hostage. Everything is in order, Mr. Miller, the attorney said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of the previous condescension. The bank has initiated the quiet title process based on your discovery. Your development loan is approved, effective immediately. We would, of course, appreciate it if the internal details regarding the administrative oversight were kept confidential. Arthur took the document. He didn't gloat. He didn't deliver a speech. He simply signed his name with a steady, deliberate hand. It was the same hand that had spent decades wrestling with seized bolts and misaligned engine parts. It was a hand that knew exactly how much pressure was needed to make something give. The integrity of the record is all I ever wanted, Arthur said, his voice quiet. I'm not interested in your bank's reputation. I'm interested in my land. As long as the paperwork stays accurate, you won't hear from me again. He left the bank and walked into the crisp, cooling air of the late afternoon. His truck was still parked at the curb, a beacon of simplicity in a landscape of gleaming glass and steel. He threw his folder onto the passenger seat and started the engine. The engine turned over instantly, smooth and rhythmic, the sound of something properly maintained. The news of the loan approval would circulate through the local development circles, of course. People would ask how a small-time mechanic had managed to secure a commercial development loan when major firms had been blocked by the bank for years. They would speculate, invent theories, and whisper about inside information or backroom deals. They would never truly understand the truth, because the truth was far less glamorous than they could ever imagine. The truth was that there was no magic. There was only the work. Arthur drove back to the site of his future development. He stepped out of the truck and walked to the perimeter, looking over the tract of land that had caused so much friction. It wasn't just dirt and weeds to him. It was a blank slate, a project that required the same careful planning and methodical execution as any complex mechanical restoration. He knew every inch of this ground now, not just physically, but legally. He knew the history of the soil as well as he knew the specs of an industrial V8. He had won, not by playing the bank's game, but by exposing the reality that the game itself was built on sand. He had proved that the system was only as strong as its foundation, and that its foundation was made of paper that anyone with the patience to read, the courage to verify, and the discipline to organize could dismantle. As he stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a technician who had finally finished a job that everyone else had declared impossible. He had taken the broken, discarded pieces of a bureaucratic mess and reassembled them into something functional. The banker had called him illiterate. But as Arthur looked out over the land that was now legally, undeniably his, he realized that the insult had been the greatest gift he could have received. It had forced him to look deeper, to work harder, and to understand the architecture of his world more clearly than he ever would have otherwise. He was the mechanic who had opened the archive, not to destroy the system, but to fix it. And in doing so, he had built a foundation that no amount of bank-issued arrogance could ever again undermine. He turned back to his truck, the engine humming in the twilight, ready to start the real work. The planning, the building, the creating, that was the easy part. He already knew exactly how everything fit together.